History seldom travels in straight lines. More often, it lurches forward through corridors of uncertainty punctuated by applause, opposition, and the slow rustle of parchment over oak desks. Such was the path in 1870 and 1871, as British Columbia teetered on the edge of destiny. It had dispatched its delegation eastward with skepticism and hope. John Sebastian Helmcken, Joseph Trutch, and Robert Carroll, the colony braced itself for a reckoning with the future. They had been gone 3 months. The journey by steamer to San Francisco and rail across the vast American continent and weeks of delegate negotiations in Ottawa had ended in triumph, or so it seemed. They carried with them not just promises, but papers, 22 articles, each a brick in the foundation of a new province. The deal was unprecedented in scope and ambition. Canada would absorb the colony's debt, provide subsidies, guarantee representation in Parliament, and most significantly, build the transcontinental railway to link the Pacific to the rest of the Dominion. But in British Columbia, consensus was not yet in the air. According to the historian Margaret Ormsby, the colony greeted the returning delegates with divided hearts. Some saw in the term salvation, others surrender. In Victoria, the local press split sharply. The British colonists, long sympathetic to Confederation, called the deal a masterstroke of statesmanship, yet others, particularly landholders and Hudson Bay men, still nostalgic for the days of imperial aloofness, bristled at the idea of subordination to Ottawa.
The deal was completed. The terms of union had been agreed to. British Columbia had accepted the terms of the Dominion of Canada, had accepted the British North America Act. London had, by order in council, added British Columbia to the Dominion. The greatest experiment in federal government was now being put in place. And on the 20th of July of 1871, British Columbia became the new western province of Canada. The Northwest Territories existed as a land bridge between that and a very small province of Manitoba, which had been established in the year 1870, and then on to the rest of Canada and farther north. The Hudson Bay Company's land purchase had cleared the way for all of this. And in the background was the Canadian and the British governments working in harmony.
The issue at hand now was ratification, not just by the Canadian Parliament, but also by the British Parliament, and most critically, by British Columbia's own Legislative Council. The final step would require a careful dance of legal precision, political theater, and imperial rubber stamping. The British Parliament, a matter of procedure. In London, the process was straightforward, if not perfunctory. The British Empire, wearied of administrating remote colonies and keen to support the maturing Dominion of Canada, welcomed the prospect of reducing its burden on the Pacific coast. The British North American Act of 1871 was swiftly drafted to enable the Union, since the original 1867 Act had not included provisions for the admission of Western colonies. The British government viewed Confederation not as an expansion of Canada, wrote historian W.P.M. Kennedy, but as a contraction of their own responsibilities. The measure passed with little opposition. It was in the eyes of the Imperial Parliament a legal formality, the final blessing of a union made elsewhere. Canada's Parliament, thunder and applause. The real battle, at least, in terms of ideas, occurred in Ottawa, where Sir John A. Macdonald, now the old chieftain of Confederation, tabled the terms of union in early 1871. The House of Commons was packed. Georges-Étienne Cartier, his health already failing, returned to the chamber to speak in favor of the agreement. The promise of a transcontinental Canada had been his vision as much as Macdonald's. Macdonald emphasized the geopolitical necessity of binding British Columbia to the east. The United States had purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, and its interest in the Pacific Northwest was growing. If we do not take the West, he warned the Commons, others shall. The debate, while spirited, focused primarily on one issue, the railway. Opposition MPs questioned whether it could be completed in 10 years. Fiscal conservatives worried about cost overruns and debt. Some liberals argued the promise had been made too hastily, a political gamble with no guarantees. Yet support remained strong, particularly from the Maritime and Ontario members who saw the railway as the spine of national unity. Historian Donald Crichton would later write, "Macdonald sold the railway not as steel, but as salvation." The House passed the terms of union. The Senate followed. With both federal houses in agreement and London's assent in hand, only one test remained, the approval of British Columbia's own government.
On Vancouver Island and in New Westminster, there was a great deal of uncertainty about the prospects of this. Would the terms be fulfilled? There was much remaining to be done. A dry dock had still to be built. There had to be a promise that the Royal Navy would stay here at Esquimalt. The debt had to be resolved. The Indian question of reserves had to be looked at. Native health had to be considered. The federal government was responsible for many of these requirements, and the federal government was often reluctant to spend money in British Columbia. British Columbia called for a railway, according to the terms of union, and was frequently called the spoilt child of Confederation. British Columbia's politics in the 1870s and 1880s spun around the question of whether or not Ottawa was doing enough for the province. And we know in Canada, even to this day, that provinces will raise a banner that Ottawa is neglecting their interests in regards to transportation or resources or infrastructure.
British Columbia, the final debate. The Legislative Council of British Columbia, composed of 23 members, most appointed, some elected, convened in Victoria in March of 1871 to debate the terms of union. Unlike the chambers in Ottawa or London, this was a setting marked by personal stakes, colonial identities, and provincial fear. Here, Confederation was not theoretical, it was transformational. The council was bitterly divided. Helmcken, the colony's most senior legislator, and an early skeptic of Confederation, had returned from Ottawa convinced. He told the chamber, "If we do not join Canada, what is left? To stand alone, defenseless, bankrupt, with American influence breathing at our back door?" But others, such as Armand de Cosmo, a newspaper firebrand turned legislator, demand even stronger guarantees, especially on the railway start date and federal accountability. De Cosmo, an ardent nationalist and a fierce anti-elitist, supported Confederation, but criticized the timidity of colonial negotiators. Opposition emerged from old guard imperialists, many of them with commercial ties to the Hudson Bay Company. They feared integration would dilute British Columbia's distinctiveness, bring in eastern taxes, and flood the coast with Ontario's bureaucrats. One flashpoint was the ambiguity of the railway clause. The commitment was clear: construction to begin within 2 years and finish in 10, but critics worried about enforcement. What if Ottawa delayed? What recourse would British Columbia have? To this, Carroll responded in his speech to the chamber, "The terms are not merely written, they are moral obligations. If Canada fails, she fails her own nationhood." Over several days, the debate intensified. Petitions arrived from outside Victoria, supportive in mining towns, hostile in land-holding enclaves. But as the days passed, it became clear that the tide was turning. The colony's fragile finances, growing isolated, and railway promise were too persuasive. In March 1871, the Legislative Council voted 16-7 in favor of the terms of union. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive.
Some people think that black shrouds were hung up in Victoria in that day, believing that the old colony was the right way, that it should have been maintained, and even that an independent British Columbia would have been the best way to go forward, say like the colony of Queensland or the colony of Newfoundland. Maybe this would have been the best thing. But there were others who saw the material requirements. But I like to think of it as a way that British Columbia was bailed out, because British Columbia was in a dire financial circumstance. There were no resources here that could be raised. Gold had disappeared as an income. The gold commissioners had all disappeared. In 1866, there had been the great tragic crisis in the economy. So it may seem strange to say this, but by default, British Columbia had to join Confederation to get itself out of the various problems that existed. But nonetheless, the idea of joining a new confederation had been achieved.
Even as the votes were counted, uncertainty lingered. Could the railway be built? Would Canada honor the terms? These concerns were not unwarranted. The Canadian Pacific Railway, as it would eventually be called, would become one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century, but also a wellspring of scandal, debt, and political crisis. The infamous Pacific Scandal of 1873, in which Macdonald's government fell over accusations of bribery linked to railway contracts, would rock the very foundation of the promises made to British Columbia. But in 1871, that future was unknown. The steel was not yet laid. The betrayal had not yet come. The ink and the parchment had barely dried. On July 20th, 1871, British Columbia formally entered Confederation. Flags were raised. Guns boomed from the harbor. The British colonists ran a triumphant headline. Union proclaimed. British Columbia a province of the Dominion. In Ottawa, Macdonald sent a telegram congratulating the new province. In London, the Colonial Office closed one more folder in its filing cabinet of fading colonies. And in Victoria, the future arrived. Imperfect, uncertain, but unstoppable. It was not a mere political union, wrote Donald Crichton, but a continental aspiration, chiseled into law. And so on the western edge of a young and fragile country, a new province, looking east, not with resignation, but with the clear-eyed understanding that nationhood is not granted, it is negotiated. Join us next time for the final episode of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore BC Day, July 20th, 1871. From sea to sea, Emery jusqu'à Admire.